Illegal now, but normal in 1970s. Think your childhood was wild? Wait until you hear what kids got away with in the 1970s. From buying smokes at the corner store to dodging lawn darts in the backyard, everyday life was packed with risks that would be banned today. Buckle up. We're diving into the shocking things that were totally normal, but are now totally illegal. Red dye number 2. In the 1970s, a big health scare swept across the country over something most folks had never given a second thought: food coloring. The spotlight was on red dye number 2 after studies at the time suggested it might be linked to serious health problems. That news spread fast and stirred up a lot of fear. The public outcry got so loud that by 1976, the US government stepped in and officially banned red dye number 2 from all food products. Now here's the twist. Mars, the company that makes M&Ms, never actually used red dye number 2 inches in their red candies. They'd always used red number 40, a totally different dye that wasn't part of the controversy. But the fear around red dyes in general had already taken hold. People were spooked, and Mars didn't want to take any chances. So, in a move that surprised everyone, they stopped making red M&Ms in 1976. Not because they had to, but to keep their customers from worrying. For the next 11 years, red M&Ms were gone. Fans had to make do with the other colors until 1987, when the red ones finally returned. By that time, food dyes had been studied more closely, and red number 40 was declared safe to eat. This whole episode shows just how powerful public opinion can be. Even when the facts say one thing, fear and perception can still drive big changes in what we see on store shelves. Playing on railroad tracks. Back in the 70s, lots of kids thought railroad tracks were just another place to play and explore. It felt like a built-in playground. They'd walk along the rails like a balance beam, race across train yards to save time, and treat it all like one big adventure. Some even laid pennies on the track, just to watch trains flatten them. Most kids, and even some adults, didn't really think about how dangerous that could be. Back then, there weren't many rules, and people didn't treat the tracks as off-limits. But that carefree attitude wouldn't fly today. Things have changed a lot. Now, railroad companies enforce tough trespassing laws, and safety groups run constant campaigns to warn folks just how deadly it can be. Today's trains are faster, quieter, and take way longer to stop. A train can be right on top of you before you even hear it coming. That's why groups like Operation Lifesaver work hard to teach everyone, especially kids, about how risky tracks really are. What used to seem like harmless fun is now seen as a serious safety issue. And if you're caught on or near the tracks now, it's not just dangerous. It could also land you with a big fine or even legal trouble. Flame retardants in the 70s. Back in the 1970s, flame retardants were used just about everywhere. You'd find them in pajamas, couches, mattresses, and even baby clothes. At the time, it felt like the right call. Fire safety was a big concern, especially for children, and adding these chemicals seemed like a smart way to protect families. But here's what no one really understood back then. Those chemicals didn't just sit on the surface. They could seep through the skin and slowly build up in the body over time. As more research came out over the years, scientists started to connect the dots. These flame retardant chemicals weren't as harmless as folks once thought. They were linked to serious health issues, things like hormone imbalances, learning problems, and even cancer. The more people learned, the louder the calls for regulation became. By the 2000s, the government finally stepped in. Many of these chemicals were banned or heavily restricted, but the truth is the harm had already been done. Tons of older furniture and clothing from the 70s and 80s are still loaded with these substances. So if you've got a vintage sofa or a set of old-school pajamas lying around, there's a good chance you're still coming into contact with those same harmful chemicals, long after they were pulled from store shelves. Clackers. If you were a kid growing up in the 1970s, there's a good chance you remember Clackers. Those loud, flashy toys that were as risky as they were fun. They were made from 2 solid acrylic balls strung together with a sturdy cord. The idea was simple. Swing the balls up and down so they smacked into each other with a sharp clack. The quicker you moved, the louder the noise and the trickier it got to keep them going. It looked cool, it sounded cool, but it also came with a pretty big risk. The problem was, if you lost your rhythm, those hard plastic balls could fly up and nail you right in the face. Worse still, some of them shattered under the force, sending sharp plastic shards flying. It didn't take long before schools and parents started to see the danger. Reports of eye injuries and bruises piled up, and clackers got banned from playgrounds all across the country. Of course, once something gets banned, it only becomes more tempting. Kids found ways to sneak them into school and show off to their friends, seeing who could keep their clackers going the longest without getting hurt. Eventually, toy makers had to change the design, swapping in softer materials to make them safer. But for those who lived through it, the original clackers still stand out as one of the wildest and most unforgettable parts of 70s childhood. Drinking age of 18. Back in the 1970s, turning 18 came with a whole lot of responsibility and freedom. You could vote, get drafted into the military, and in many states, you could legally order a drink. The movement to lower the drinking age really picked up steam after the 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, dropping the voting age from 21 to 18. The idea was straightforward. If you were old enough to cast a ballot and risk your life in war, then you were old enough to handle a beer. That reasoning made sense to a lot of people back then, and by the middle of the decade, most states had lowered the legal drinking age to somewhere between 18 and 20. But that shift had serious consequences. Drunk driving accidents climbed fast, especially among teens and young adults. Studies showed alcohol was involved in more than 60% of traffic deaths, with a large number of those crashes involving drivers aged 16 to 20. With the numbers getting worse, lawmakers knew something had to be done. In 1984, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, which didn't force states directly, but made them an offer they couldn't refuse. If a state didn't raise its drinking age back to 21, it would lose federal highway funds. That did the trick. By 1988, every state had raised the age. It might seem hard to picture now, but during the 1970s, grabbing a beer at 18 wasn't just legal, it was completely normal. Which of these 70s memories do you remember most clearly, and did you ever get hurt playing with one of these toys? Cyclamates. Back in the 1960s, Cyclamates were the sweet secret behind just about every diet product on the shelf. These artificial sweeteners popped up in everything from sodas to low-calorie desserts and even some processed foods. They were about 30 times sweeter than regular sugar and had 0 calories, making them perfect for anyone trying to cut back on sugar. One of the most popular diet drinks of the time, Tab, owed its unique flavor to Cyclamates. But in 1969, the sweet ride came to a sudden halt. That year, a study raised serious concerns. Lab rats given extremely high doses of Cyclamates developed bladder tumors, and that sparked fears about cancer risk in humans. The news spread fast and the public got nervous. The US government didn't wait around. Cyclamates were pulled from the shelves in 1969, and the official ban took effect in 1970. Food companies scrambled to adjust, switching to saccharin, another sugar substitute that would later face its own share of safety debates. Interestingly, while the US stuck to the ban, many countries didn't. Cyclamates are still used today in places like Europe and Canada, and as time went on, newer studies questioned whether the original cancer link was ever truly valid. Still, the US never lifted the ban, leaving Cyclamates behind as a forgotten piece of American food history, one that reminds us how quickly public health concerns can reshape what we eat and drink. Lead paint. In the 1970s, lead-based paint was everywhere, just as common in homes as shag rugs and wood-paneled walls. It was the go-to choice for painting walls, windows, furniture, and even cribs and toys. People loved it because it was bright, tough, and stuck around for years without peeling. On the surface, it seemed like a smart, reliable option, but underneath that glossy finish was a danger no one really talked about until it was too late. As more studies came out, the dangers of lid exposure started making headlines. Kids were especially at risk. Just breathing in lead dust or touching peeling paint could lead to serious health issues, things like developmental problems, trouble learning, and even damage to organs. Once the risk became clear, the U.S. government stepped in. In 1978, they officially banned lead-based paint for use in homes. But by then, the damage had been done. Millions of houses, apartments, and schools were already coated in it, and many of those buildings still stand today. Even now, if you're fixing up an old house, you've got to be careful. Scraping or sanding old paint can send toxic lead dust into the air. It's wild to think that something so common for so long was actually making people sick. The story of lead paint is a harsh lesson. Just because something's popular doesn't mean it's safe. Child labor. In the 1970s, seeing kids with jobs wasn't out of the ordinary at all. It was especially common in farming communities, family-run businesses, or homes where money was tight. A lot of parents back then felt that working young wasn't just helpful, it was important. It taught kids how to be responsible, how to handle money, and how to grow up with a strong work ethic. Delivering newspapers before sunrise, helping out on the farm, or doing shifts at a corner store, all of that was seen as part of growing up. But in many cases, kids were putting in long, tough hours, sometimes missing out on school just to help make ends meet. Even though the Fair Labor Standards Act had been around since 1938, the rules about child labor weren't all that strict, especially when it came to agriculture. Under certain conditions, it was still legal for children to work, even in dangerous environments. That meant kids were sometimes using heavy equipment, working around chemicals, or doing hard labor for hours on end. As more people started to speak out, lawmakers began to take notice. In 1976, the Child Labor Amendment was introduced to push for stronger protections, but it didn't bring much change right away. The real shift started in 1989, when the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That marked a turning point, putting the focus back on education instead of early employment. Over time, the U.S. strengthened the rules under the FLSA, eventually making it illegal for children to work in dangerous or harmful conditions. Cigarette advertising on TV. Back in the 1970s, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing cigarette ads. They were on your TV, in magazines, stretched across billboards, everywhere. These ads didn't just show people smoking, they turned it into a lifestyle. Cool cowboys, glamorous women, and charming celebrities made it look like lighting up was the key to confidence, freedom, and style. Names like the Marlboro Man and Joe Camel weren't just ad characters, they became icons. And those catchy slogans? People remembered them for years, but as the health risks of smoking became harder to ignore, the government stepped in. In 1971, cigarette ads were officially banned from television and radio. That was a big deal, a turning point in the way tobacco could be marketed. Still, the tobacco companies didn't throw in the towel, they shifted gears. Instead of TV spots, they focused on print ads, splashing their logos across magazines, race cars, and sports arenas. They even made sure their products popped up in Hollywood films, keeping cigarettes front and center in popular culture. So, while the ad ban took them off the airwaves, cigarettes still held onto a strong presence. It took years and a lot more rules before tighter restrictions really started cutting into the influence of big tobacco. Smoking on airplanes. Flying in the 1970s felt like stepping into a whole different world. As soon as you boarded, you'd see flight attendants dressed to impress. And almost immediately, you'd notice the thick cloud of cigarette smoke hanging in the air. Planes had smoking and non-smoking sections, but honestly, that didn't matter much. The smoke didn't stay put. It floated through the entire cabin, so whether you lit up or not, you were stuck breathing it the whole way. Back then, no one thought twice about it. Lighting up mid-flight was just something passengers did. Ashtrays were built right into the armrests, and smoke blended with the smells of jet fuel and whatever meal they happened to be serving. It was all part of the flying experience. But over time, people started speaking up. The risks of secondhand smoke became harder to ignore, and health experts pushed for change. The first big shift came in 1988 when smoking was banned on short domestic flights in the U.S. That was just the beginning. Over the next 10 years, more rules followed. And by the time 2000 rolled around, the ban was total. No more smoking on any US flights, period. Do you think kids today are missing out? Or are we better off with the safety rules we have now? Why? Lawn darts. In the 1970s, lawn darts were just part of the fun in almost every backyard. Families would gather for barbecues or summer get-togethers and someone would pull out the lawn darts. The goal was simple. Toss the big metal darts into a ring on the grass, kind of like horseshoes, but with more airtime. It all seemed harmless enough, but those darts weren't made of soft plastic. They had long, sharp metal tips and enough weight to drive straight into the ground, or worse, into someone. The problem was, these darts didn't always land where they were supposed to. A bad throw, a sudden gust of wind, or a curious kid walking into the line of fire could lead to serious injuries. Over the years, hospitals started seeing more and more accidents, some of them deadly. Still, the game stayed popular and many parents didn't realize just how dangerous it really was. After enough warnings and tragic stories, the government stepped in. By the late 1980s, lawn darts were officially banned in the US. A safer version with soft tips came later, but it never quite had the same edge. For those who grew up with the original version, part of the excitement wasn't just aiming at the target, it was hoping you didn't get hit. Looking back now, it's hard to believe something that risky was once a regular part of summer play. Leaded gasoline. Back in the 1970s, a visit to the gas station was a lot simpler, but also a lot more dangerous than most people knew. You didn't choose between leaded and unleaded. Almost every pump offered leaded gasoline. It had been the standard for decades. Drivers liked it because it kept engines running smoothly and reduced knocking, and car makers designed engines to rely on it. It seemed like a win all around, until scientists started sounding the alarm. What nobody realized at first was that burning leaded fuel was filling the air with toxic lead particles. And this wasn't just an environmental issue, it was a serious health threat. Children were hit the hardest. Research started linking lead exposure to developmental delays, lower IQs, and even long-term brain damage. The more studies that came out, the harder it became to ignore the problem. By the mid-1970s, the government stepped in. They ordered a slow phase-out of leaded gasoline, aiming to protect public health without disrupting the auto industry overnight. Still, plenty of people were skeptical. Drivers worried that unleaded fuel would mess up their engines, and switching habits wasn't easy. But the phase-out continued, and by the 1990s, leaded gas was nearly gone. It marked the end of an era, and a major win for public health. Drunk driving with high BAC limits. Back in the 1970s, drinking and driving wasn't just common. It was almost expected in some circles. The legal blood alcohol limits were much higher than they are now, with many states allowing drivers to be on the road with a BAC of 0.10% or more. That's noticeably above today's national limit of 0.08%. And even if someone was clearly drunk, law enforcement often looked the other way. In a lot of places, an officer might just give a quick warning or tell the driver to be careful getting home. It wasn't just casual nights out either. People left bars, parties, and even office happy hours thinking nothing of hopping behind the wheel after several drinks. The attitude was casual, and many truly believed they were fine to drive, as long as they felt okay. There was little shame or stigma, and few people considered drunk driving a serious issue. But things started to change as more tragic stories came to light. A major shift happened in 1980 when Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MAD, was founded by a mother who lost her child to a drunk driver. That group helped spark a national movement. Through tireless advocacy, they pushed for tougher laws, public education, and more consistent enforcement. By the mid-1980s, most states had lowered their legal limits to 0.08%, and society began to treat drunk driving as a dangerous crime, not just a poor decision. Lax Seatbelt Laws. In In the 1970s, wearing a seatbelt was more of a suggestion than a rule. A lot of cars, especially older ones, didn't even have belts in the back seats, and when they did, most people didn't bother using them. It wasn't unusual to see kids climbing around the car, sitting on armrests, or even standing in the back while the car cruised down the highway. Buckling up just wasn't something people thought much about. Back then, many drivers believed seatbelts were uncomfortable or even risky. Some folks thought they'd get trapped in a wreck if they were strapped in. That mindset stuck around for a while, and even as safety experts pushed for change, plenty of people just weren't convinced. Campaigns tried to raise awareness, but usage stayed low. It wasn't until 1984 that real change began, when New York passed the first mandatory seatbelt law. A lot of folks didn't like it at first, but slowly, other states followed. By the 1990s, seatbelt laws had spread across the country. These days, we know better. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says seatbelts cut the risk of dying by 45% in the front seat and up to 60% in the back. It's wild to think there was ever a time when something so simple and so effective was optional. Minimal child car seat regulations. Back in the 1970s, child car seat laws were barely a blip on the radar. Most parents didn't use them, and when they did, it wasn't for safety. It was more about keeping the child in place or giving them a better view out the window. It wasn't unusual to see kids sprawled out on the back seat, standing up while the car was moving, or even riding in the front seat without a seatbelt. Babies were often held in someone's arms, with parents believing their own grip was strong enough to keep them safe if anything went wrong. Sure, car seats existed, but they weren't designed for crash protection. They were mostly boosters meant to prop kids up so they could see better during the ride. There were no real safety standards, no crash tests, and most people didn't think twice about skipping them altogether. That mindset finally started to shift after a pivotal 1985 study from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. It revealed something shocking. Car accidents were the leading cause of death for children aged 1 to 4. That wake-up call changed everything. Now, every state has laws that require child safety seats, and we've come a long way. Modern car seats, when used correctly, reduce fatal injuries by 54% for toddlers and an incredible 71% for infants. It's hard to believe that something so crucial was once seen as optional. Thank you for watching. To continue with more content, comment 1 to let us know you're still following. Selling unpasteurized milk. In the 1970s, raw milk was easy to come by and popular with folks who believed in its natural health benefits. Many swore by its rich, creamy taste and claimed it was better for digestion and overall wellness. Small farms and local dairies often sold it straight to consumers, usually with little to no oversight. Buying raw milk fresh from the farm was a regular part of life in rural areas, and even in some cities. But as time went on, serious health concerns started to emerge. Scientists and doctors began connecting unpasteurized milk to dangerous bacteria like Salmonella, E. coli, and Listeria. People were getting sick, and some of the infections turned out to be severe. By the early 1980s, public health officials were raising red flags and warning people about the risks of drinking raw milk. Things took a major turn in 1987 when the FDA stepped in. They made pasteurization mandatory for all milk sold across state lines. Not long after, individual states began passing their own rules, some allowing raw milk sales with strict conditions, others banning it completely. Today, raw milk is still a hot topic. Supporters argue it's healthier and more natural, while health experts warn about the risks. Either way, the days of buying it freely like folks did in the 70s are long gone. Candy cigarettes. Back in the 1970s, candy cigarettes were a regular sight in every kid's candy stash. You could find them at every corner store. Those slim, white sugar sticks wrapped in paper, often with a little red tip to look like they were lit. Some even had a clever trick built in, a small puff of powdered sugar that would blow out when you exhaled, mimicking real smoke. For kids, it was all about playing grown-up. copying how adults held them, tapped them, and pretended to take a drag. At the time, no one really raised an eyebrow. Smoking was just a part of everyday life. You saw it on TV shows, in restaurants, at the movies, even on airplanes. So it didn't seem odd that kids would want to imitate what they saw all around them. Parents rarely thought twice about tossing a pack of candy cigarettes into the shopping cart. But as the health dangers of smoking became clearer, those sweet little sticks didn't seem so harmless. Critics pointed out that giving kids candy made to look like cigarettes could make smoking feel normal, maybe even cool. Slowly, opinions started to shift. By the late 20th century, rules tightened. Some countries banned them outright, while others changed the name and look, rebranding them as candy sticks with no cigarette styling at all. Today, it's almost unthinkable to market candy that mimics smoking. But for kids growing up in the 70s, candy cigarettes were just one more fun treat from the corner store. Owning exotic pets without permits. Back in the 1970s, owning exotic pets wasn't all that unusual, and it definitely wasn't tightly controlled. You could walk into a local pet store and come out with an iguana, a colorful macaw, or even a boa constrictor. No questions asked. In some places, people even kept monkeys or wildcats as household pets. There were hardly any rules, and little thought was given to long-term care, safety, or the impact on the animals themselves. But as more people started bringing exotic creatures into their homes, problems quickly surfaced. Some of these animals escaped or were abandoned, creating dangers for local ecosystems. Others injured their owners or neighbors. These weren't just house pets, they were wild animals, and it became clear that things were getting out of hand. In 1980, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stepped in and started setting rules to slow the trade and protect both animals and people. By the time the late 90s and early 2000s rolled around, most states had passed laws requiring permits, ownership papers, and clear standards for how these animals should be cared for. Still, enforcement was tricky. A 2013 report from the Association of Zoos and Aquariums estimated that over 50,000 exotic pets were being kept without proper permits at the time. It's wild to think that just a few decades earlier you could casually pick up a snake or a monkey like it was no big deal. Minimal airline security. In the 1970s, flying felt casual, almost carefree. There were no TSA checkpoints, no full-body scanners, and no need to take off your shoes or toss out your shampoo. You could stroll right up to the gate with your family, and there were no restrictions on who could see you off or welcome you when you landed. Cockpit doors? They stayed open during flights and no one thought much of it. But that laid-back approach came with serious risks. Hijackings became alarmingly frequent, especially in the early 70s. In 1972 alone, there were more than 200 hijacking incidents worldwide. Some were political stunts, others were about money, but either way, the danger was real. Still, the response was slow. It would take years before security procedures saw real change. Everything shifted after the tragedy of September 11, 2001. That day marked a turning point in how the world looked at air travel. The U.S. government passed the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, creating the TSA and rolling out tough new rules. From reinforced cockpit doors to detailed baggage checks and stricter passenger screenings, flying would never be the same again. What was once a relaxed routine became one of the most heavily guarded parts of modern life. Times sure have changed. What was once everyday life in the 70s would raise eyebrows or alarms today. Did we miss one of your favorite memories? Drop it in the comments. If you love this nostalgic ride, check out more in our series. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share Past Not Past with friends who'll enjoy the blast from the past.